Okay, we're over to the next session, and I see Al, you're there, so wonderful to see you again. So this session is called Driving a Strategic Communication Strategy with Alistair Marshall, who's Head of Internal Communications at Coles, and I mentioned him a bit earlier. So Alistair, if you weren't around, your ears might have been burning. So Alistair has been in corporate communications for more than 20 years with some of Australia's largest companies. He's very passionate about internal communications and using communication to engage employees with their organisations. As I said, he's currently Head of Internal Comms at Coles, where he's responsible for communications with the team with more than 115,000 employees. Just a few. Prior to this, he was also the Head of Internal Comms with Medibank, and prior to that was Head of Internal Comms with Insurance Australia Group. Before that, which is where I met him, he was in a senior communications role at ANZ, and prior to that with Royal Bank of Scotland. So over to you, Al.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Emily, do you want to just give a thumbs up if everything's working? I assume it is. Yep, all good. Excellent. So my topic, which Emily gave me to talk to, was driving a strategic communications strategy, which is probably one strategic too many. So what I thought I'd do today is I'm just going to talk for maybe sort of 15 minutes. And I think the value in these things is very often the questions that you guys have. So I'll leave plenty of time to have a chat. But what I thought I'd do is just talk a little bit about how I think about strategy in an internal comms context, and then give 3 examples of how we've taken what I would think to be a strategic way of thinking at Coles to improve our internal comms. So as Zora said in her kind introduction, Coles is a big organisation. So yep, about 120,000 team members at the moment. So 900 supermarkets, or close to 900 supermarkets, another 1,000 express sites, and a similar number of liquor shops. So it's a big organisation across Australia, and internal comms is complex and often imperfect. So I certainly don't want to give anyone the impression that we've got this nailed, but hopefully we've got some good examples and some good learnings that you guys can learn from. So strategy in an internal comms point of view, I sometimes think we do overuse the word strategy, and I think sometimes people use the word strategy to make themselves feel cleverer or more important. But I tend to think of strategy simply as like, what are we going to do? It's as simple as that. It's not any magical word. It's just simply a way of thinking about what it is you are actually going to do in a given situation. And there's a terrific quote about strategy, which you've probably heard, not from a very nice person, but Mike Tyson famously sort of said, everyone has a strategy until you get punched in the mouth. And that's always struck a chord with me, because I think sometimes strategies are very much paper documents. They take up an enormous amount of time, and then the real world comes along and it's not really worth the paper it's written on. And I think COVID was an example of that last year, where, everyone got a bit of a punch in the mouth, and no one could have predicted that. And how strategically you responded to that really was a matter of how well you acted in the moment and made those judgments on what you are going to do. And I think we sometimes underestimate the importance of strategy as a dynamic and conversational activity. So not a planning, let's spend weeks writing up a document, but a conversation, often with an executive or an email exchange or a series of texts or whatever it is, that gets you to that point where you decide what it is you're going to do. So I think, yep, of course you've got a plan. Strategies are important. I don't want to, belittle the importance of strategic planning, but I sort of really wanted to start this out by just saying this is not stuff that you do once a year and put on a document and then kind of plod along and do it again next year. I think also, you know, and sorry, just back to Mike Tyson, he was asked about that quote once, and he said, well, what do you do? Do you have a plan? And his response to that was, well, it helps you if you're a really good boxer. And I think there's something in that for us too, in that before kind of getting too caught up in strategy, it actually helps if you're a good internal communicator. And by that, I mean just knowing the craft and knowing what I think of as being the 4 things that we're here to do. So what are you going to do? Well, here are the 4 things I think that any communication strategy has to consider, whether that's in the moment or in a document. So first and foremost, our job in internal comms is to inform, to tell sometimes, but to help our employees or our internal stakeholders understand what is going on. So we have a primary information purpose that I think above all else we need to fulfill. So for instance, yesterday Coles announced we were no longer going to sell single-use plastic in our stores. So straws, plastic knives, plastic plates, all of that sort of stuff. Quite an important announcement. A good announcement for us in that it's about becoming more sustainable. So we've got, as I said, 100,000 people working in our supermarkets who have conversations with customers every day. It is really important that those people, our team members, know that and are able to talk about that before customers come up to them and either have a complaint about the fact that they can no longer buy their straws, or you know, provide positive feedback or whatever it might be. So one, information. The second thing is very much around where the organisation is going and how it's going to get there. So you can call this the strategic framework for the organisation or the narrative framework. Sometimes it's about a sort of purpose, strategy and vision framework. But you know, at its simplest, it's providing some sort of backdrop for all of that information that you're communicating, so that people can make sense of it. So for us at Coles, we have a purpose to sustainably feed all Australians, to help them live healthier and happier lives. We have a vision to be Australia's most trusted supermarket, and we have a strategy built around 3 pillars: inspiring customers, smarter selling, and winning together. None of that probably means a lot to you on the line, but that's the framework we use and we've invested in really heavily over the last 2.5 years. And all of our communications really pins back to that context and that framework. Sometimes I think we're probably guilty of it all sounding a bit like a kind of Soviet tractor plan, but you know, it's really important that I think that in telling people what we are doing, in informing people, that we are able to provide that into a framework that makes sense and there's a story behind it. So that's the second thing, that sense of where the organisation is going, or the narrative framework. The third thing, and you know, this is, I'm not sure what others might think of this, but I think it's really an important part of internal comms to give people who work in your organisation reasons to be proud of your organisation. And you know, sometimes I think we can be guilty perhaps of being cheerleaders a bit in internal comms, but I think it's absolutely vital that people who invest their time, invest so much of their life working in your organisation, are given the opportunity to advocate for your organisation, are given the opportunity to feel proud and to feel proud about the role that they play in it. So that to me is really critical, the third thing, providing reasons to be proud. And then the fourth thing, and this is what I'm particularly interested in, but it's sometimes the hardest thing, is providing channels or frameworks for listening, feedback, and two-way communication. So a little bit of a sidetrack there, but I think, you know, if you're going to talk about strategy, you really need to know strategically what it is you're there to do. And for me, it's those 4 things. It's about informing team members. It's about providing that wider organizational narrative. It's about helping people feel proud of your organization and advocating for it, and it's providing a listening framework. So in a sense, sort of the answer to the strategic question, well, what are you going to do? to me, often is answered by looking back at those 4 things. So, you will know often, perhaps within a day of spending time in an organization, how well those 4 things are happening. Do people know what's going on? You can pretty quickly ascertain that. Is there a story? Is there a structure around what the company's trying to do or the organization's trying to do? Do people feel proud? Do people have reasons to feel proud? Do people feel listened to? So sometimes your assessment and your judgment of those things can actually be really easy. Sometimes it can be far more subtle and sophisticated than that. But I wouldn't underestimate sometimes just the basic principles of just thinking back to those 4 things, whether it's about a particular topic or initiative or project or issue, or more generally at an organizational level. How are you scoring on each of those 4 things, and being honest about it, and then building your strategy, what it is you're going to do around those things. But sometimes it takes some work, right? And I think it helps, obviously, to have some evidence and some data when you're presenting your thoughts around what you're going to do. Otherwise, you can, as maybe I do occasionally, come across as being a little hasty in thinking or making that recommendation. But and I think importantly, you need to do the work. I can sit here and say, well, this worked at Coles, or that worked at Coles, or this worked at IAG or Medibank. But ultimately, it's the combination of your assessment and your knowledge and the context, the circumstances. So, okay, so how do you turn that then into a strategy? I think there's any number of ways to do this. I'm sure you've all seen comms or communications strategies. If you haven't, if this is sort of an area that's new to you, jump on Google. There's infinite numbers of templates, documents, etc., that provide some variation of objectives, audiences, messages, timing, tactics, channels, measurement. Like, that's, as long as I've been doing this, that's been this sort of stock standard framework for creating an internal comms strategy. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all, and there's definitely times, particularly when something requires some formal thought and some formal socialization, when that's a sort of useful framework. But I think sometimes it can be a bit problematic, and I think at its worst it can lead to a sort of, as I was saying at the start, a little bit of a paper exercise and a little bit of a formulaic exercise that either doesn't quite actually get at what it is you're going to do, or buries what you're going to do deep in a sort of document, or just doesn't generate very good thinking. You kind of go through all of those processes, which is sort of designed to funnel you into a decision, and then you're a little bit lost. And then you sort of, sometimes with that kind of strategic approach, you're left at this moment where you've got to come up with some really big ideas and do something, and you're not quite sure what to do. So I sort of have found over the years, and I think a lot of people who are using human-centered design methods these days, but I've certainly found a simpler approach that's probably a little bit closer to the scientific method is often a better way to work. And I'll give some examples of that in a minute. But for me, that usually starts with identifying a problem. So what are we trying to solve here? And I think that might go back to those 4 things I mentioned. So it might be, look, we have a problem with listening here, or we have a problem with the fact that people don't know what's going on. So obviously that requires some understanding and some research, but you might be able to identify that problem early on, and it might be quite an obvious problem. I think then, and this is what I think is really critical, and what sometimes that more conventional comms strategic process sometimes undercooks a bit, is doing your own research and analysis in the field, and really interrogating that problem. So, for instance, at Coles, and I'm sure in your organisations too, we have twice yearly engagement surveys. So, of our 120,000 people, we'll get 80,000 responses to that. So that's 80,000 data sets twice a year on a whole range of questions, not just ones relating to communication, but providing sort of deep insight into what's going on at a communications level. So for me, that's an absolute trove of information and research that I would mine for, when trying to solve, any problem, whatever it is, that's there. This is, more of a human-centered design, but spending time observing people in their natural environment, sort of taking an anthropological, approach, is I think hugely useful from an internal comms point of view. So we're lucky we have supermarkets, we can get out, I can talk to people, but whatever it is that your organisation does, I always think, you don't always learn the most important things by, as it is at the moment, sitting at home. So finding ways to connect with people, finding ways to learn from people and gain that firsthand observational insight. And then I think also perhaps we don't do this enough either, in terms of researching, looking around outside your company, outside your industry sometimes, and even outside of the field of internal comms. So, and I'll touch on this in an example in a minute, but there are very few problems in your organisation from a comms point of view that someone else hasn't encountered somewhere else. And there are many ways of borrowing those good ideas and applying them or trying them. So those sort of, what I'm describing, start with the problem, do your research. Then I think, again, it's what the sort of bigger plan approach doesn't always do. Do some experiments. So, and I'm going to get to some examples here at the moment, but small scale, quick. All right, what if we tried this? Okay, let's try it in one store. Let's see what happens. Let's try it in 5 stores, or let's try it with 50 people. And let's do it now. Let's not wait until we have, I don't know, reams of approvals. Let's learn from it, and if it's wrong, it's wrong. If it needs tinkering, it needs tinkering. If it can be scaled, brilliant. So that's to me, I suppose, a method that's just been a little bit more practical to get to the same perhaps strategic place that maybe an in-depth plan might get you to. And I also think it's a more useful framework for having conversations about strategy rather than borrowing away on your own with a document. So, if I'm talking to our Chief Operating Officer about a problem in terms of communications, very often the conversation might be just simply those things. What is the problem? Let's agree on that. What research do we know? What do we know? What data do we have? What do Walmart do? What do Amazon do? What are big organizations in Europe doing? And then, okay, well, why don't we try something? Let's experiment with that at a very, very small level. And he'll say, come back in a week, Al, I want to know what you find. So I'm going to give 3 examples next. I think that's probably the easiest way to sort of think about this. And then we'll hopefully just have a bit of a chat. But example number 1, so I joined Coles 3 years ago. And when I joined, and I think, I'm sure when you join an organization, I spent first probably week or 2 really just getting a sense of what was going on, very much in those 4 categories I mentioned earlier. So that involved, talking to people. I ran some focus groups. We did a survey. I looked at the engagement on MySay data, and it became evident that one of the problems, and there's lots and lots of problems. It's always lots of problems, but one of the really obvious ones was that team members in our store support centre, so our head office, didn't feel well informed. So they felt that they weren't hearing about business news in time, and often weren't getting it before, say, it was announced externally. So, quite an important problem. And it was interesting then in researching that problem that, one of the questions I then asked people was, well, how do you find out what's going on in your own life? And, these are busy people like your employees. And, the answer most people had in one form or another was between about 7 and 8 a.m. was their time for news collection in their own, their own world. So that might be watching sunrise. It might be scrolling through, their social feed, or it might be reading something like the New Daily or the Sydney Morning Herald's alert in the morning. So, that sort of, I thought that was interesting that there's a little window there between 7 and 8 where people were had the time and were motivated to be looking for news. And meanwhile, I remember hearing the head of comms at Telstra, who Zora knows, Jason, who I think is at NAB now. And I remember him saying he'd been experimenting with a daily news alert, a bit like the New Daily or the New York Times at Telstra. So I thought, I'll ring up a friend of mine who's just gone there and let's find out about that. And she sent me a copy, which if anyone from Telstra is on the line, I'm sure she didn't break any privacy rules in doing that. But I thought that was interesting. So I thought, well, maybe this is worth trying. Let's try a quick, punchy, pre 8 a.m. Here's what you need to know today update for head office folks. So let's try it with one team. So I started with the produce team because at that point they sat near me, and I thought, oh well, I'll be able to go over and walk over to them and just see what they think. And yeah, look, the feedback was great. I mean, they appreciated the fact, if nothing else, that we were sending them something regularly at 8 o'clock saying, here's what you need to know today. At first, I'd filled it with probably stuff that was a little bit too esoteric. And so really, and we trialed it, I think, for 6 months before we ended up rolling it out across all 5,000 people. And so this is nearly 3 years ago. That's now a core channel for that audience. We still do it. It probably doesn't resemble hugely what we sent out in those early experiments. It's become a lot more sophisticated, but it goes back to that early identification of the problem, and then research that was, I guess, that insight around 7 to 8 a.m. Telstra doing this, let's try it. So that's example one. Example two, about 18 months ago, we were pouring through our engagement survey data, and it was interesting. I mean, this was perhaps sometimes the value of big surveys and data and analysing those through different demographics and criteria. But we found a really interesting problem that older part-time women scored considerably lower on many, well, not many, many of our communication metrics. So particularly the informed one, which is the one we've just been talking about, but also the sense of understanding what the company was trying to do. And it was quite interesting because it wasn't across the board. There were parts of the supermarkets that people would score quite highly on. The other area was night fill, so the people who go in at night and fill the shelves. So those two cohorts were markedly lower, and it was really striking. So, next step, research. Well, let's go talk to them, right? Let's find out what's getting in the way of those team members from feeling as well informed or having as good an understanding of our strategy as they should. So the insight we found really was as simple as the fact that they weren't attending huddles. So every supermarket has a huddle, which is typically run at about 10 o'clock during the day. And so immediately that rules out night fill. Now, night fill are meant to have a huddle when they start, but they're time poor. The managers who lead those teams often have, really demanding schedules that they've got to hit, and those huddles weren't happening as consistently as they should. So that answered that one. The reason older part-time women weren't attending the huddles is because overwhelmingly those people worked on service, so on the checkouts, and those team members, if you're rostered on, you're not attending a huddle. You're working on the register. All that, and the fact that if you're part-time and you're perhaps you only work 6 hours a week or 12 hours a week, you may simply never get to a huddle. So that was a really interesting insight, I guess. The experiment then was, okay, well, what if we, and we were quite limited in what we can do, and we still are a little bit, but we don't have amazing platforms, as no doubt, you know, some organisations do, some organisations don't. We obviously can't reach all of our store team members electronically. You know, you're working on a shop floor. They don't have email addresses. So we tried sending every Friday evening to people's personal addresses a video and a short message saying, here's what's happening and here's everything you need to know about Coles this week. And the feedback from that, particularly with those cohorts I mentioned, was absolutely game-changing. We then scaled that literally just in time for COVID, and it became a critical, I guess, engagement tool during COVID, and it's something we've kept going. The third one, and I'm conscious I'm just talking a bit too long here, listening, real challenge around listening and getting two-way feedback in our stores. Not so hard to work out why that's a problem. A lot of it's to do with power and power distance and time. But again, in talking to people who'd been around, and this is not a new problem, it was interesting hearing from older team members who'd said, oh, well, look, you know, 10 or 20 years ago, we used to have these great forums called team member circles where team members would be 6 or 7 would represent their store, and every couple of weeks they would get together and, you know, in a structured way, provide feedback on all the little gripes, inconveniences, and challenges that they were facing in their store, and their suggestions or ideas that might improve them. And that used to happen in a pretty structured way. So that's based really on that simple idea. We tried that initially again with 8 stores. We then scaled it to 80 stores, and now it's across all, you know, 800 or 900 stores. So they're 3 examples of what I think are quite strategic ways of approaching problems. None of them really involved a written communications plan, although we do that as well. But each of them emerged through the kind of process I've just described. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm conscious it's 11:58, and if we've got 10 more minutes, Zora, we can have a chat.
Well, we have 11. So
we have 11.
We have 11 minutes. I could chat with you for ages, but I will ask the questions that are posed before I ask any of mine. So one is from Elise. She's asked, what's the biggest mistake you see in developing communication strategies?
I sort of mentioned the overdoing. You know, I've seen communication strategies, particularly for projects, I think, that are like 35 pages and really, you know, really meticulous documents, but don't ever get done, you know, or are just not doable because they're proposing activities and tactics that either aren't going to work or they're impractical. And I think skipping those skipping those steps of really researching the problem, and then secondly experimenting at a smaller scale, you know, they're probably the two, because I think, and I've made these mistakes myself plenty of times. I think you think it's going to be a great idea, let's do it, and you do it, and you've wasted 3 months on something that didn't work. So that, you know, we've really learnt to use that experimentation process to try things and see if they work before, you know, throwing all your eggs in the basket.
It sounds like you've been investing a fair bit in the design thinking process there. Yeah,
well, we did. I mean, IAG were big on that, so that's probably where I got sort of first exposed to design thinking, and I immediately enjoyed it because I enjoyed the process. Like I thought it was fun, and I think that's important too. You know, I hate writing 30-page strategy documents. It's a chore. So,
and I'm a strategist.
But I enjoy getting out and talking to people and seeing things and observing, and I have better ideas. I have more insights. I I just work better that way. And I think it's more collaborative too. You know, I think strategy should be a collaborative problem. It's not something, you know, none of those examples I've described are ideas that I or the internal comms team simply came up with and said, here you go. You know, they're all ideas or things that we developed in conjunction with leaders, PNC, you know, ops, different people. And I think that human-centered design process or design thinking process is really good at setting you up to work with people and to not kind of go, here's the solution. So yeah, I love it. So.
Yeah, I think one of the big mistakes is people jump from problem to solution straight away without doing the bit in the middle. So that's just me adding to that. From Anne-Marie, are your engagement surveys driven by internal comms or HR?
They're driven by HR. So we don't, I mean, we obviously communicate the surveys themselves and the findings, and we're really involved in it, but it's, yeah, it's HR.
Cool. From Julie, committing to daily employee comms updates is huge. How much time/resource does it take? And have you automated the content development? Clearly it's worthwhile and giving ROI.
It is worthwhile. So it's become easier because I think we've become more practiced at it. I would say it's a good hour and a half a day. That's probably the best way to describe it. We have a graduate in the team, and that the role typically falls to them with a lot of support. But we're not a big team. I mean, for the size of the company, we've got like 4 people in the centre, in internal comms. It's not a big team. So I think, you know, I tend to try and find things that can make an impact or make a difference at scale, because we don't have time. We're just simply not resourced to business partner with, you know, GMs and that kind of thing. So yeah, it is, but you get better at it, and I think, you know, it's become a really valuable channel for us.
I do remember I was working on a contract in-house at Telstra, and do remember receiving those morning notifications on my email all the time. And it was going back to a time when at Telstra they were looking at how do we create brand ambassadors internally within Telstra. And it goes back to a number of years ago when we brought out the IABC chair from the States, Robin McCasland, and she had worked at Dell at the time, and they really did that really well. So their employees were really great at being brand ambassadors, and she took them through that. So, you know, as soon as you were working at Telstra, you had to go through a process to understand how to do social yourself. So there are all these steps and regular, you know, the key principles. So then when you receive this morning email, you could see there is stuff that you could actually post if you wanted to. So it amplifies really the reach.
It's a great idea. And I think the other thing that they did, and again, I don't know whether these things continued or whether they worked, but the other idea I liked that I know that they stood up was the sort of barbecue conversation app. And I think, yeah, in some ways the method or the channel is not that important. I think it's just simply about giving people the permission and the content so that, like today with us, you know, removing plastic from shelves, and that's not such a controversial one, but there's plenty of controversial ones, so that people at least have a fighting chance of, you know, knowing the position and being able to discuss it with their many thousands of customers that walk past them that day.
All right, we have 5 minutes left, and there's a couple more questions. So it sort of moves on the screen. It's really irritating. Okay, here we go. What are your best tips on ensuring the business delivers the important information or updates you need to communicate to your internal stakeholders? Internal comms team members can't communicate what we don't know about.
That's a good one. Okay, so this is perhaps another sort of agile type method, but every Thursday we now have it used to be a stand-up meeting, but now it's a sit-down-at-home meeting with a really broad cross-functional team. So corporate affairs, media folks like me, but also marketing, P&C, some of the product categories. It's half an hour only, so it's pretty snappy, and that is a really open, here's what's coming up in the next 2 weeks meeting. And we have we use Trello, and we use a few tools to help us with that, but it's really designed so that we know, that our media team know what we're all doing and what we're planning to do. And it's not necessarily the most senior folks. It's it's sort of people who do the work, and that then generates a document that we give to our GM of corporate affairs that goes to our exec leadership team every Monday. So it's sort of developed over time, but it's a really useful way for us to. And internal comms runs that meeting, so we initiated that meeting, and we shamelessly use it as a way to generate content. I suppose the other way to answer that question is make sure your channels and content is really good so that people want to be in it,
Sort of goes to one of those other questions. How do you position the IC function to the rest of the company, and within the exec team, do you have an overarching comms plan you share with the stakeholders?
So we do have an overarching comms plan that we review and refresh each January, because that sort of seems to be when we have time to do it. And it's not super complicated. It's really just an honest assessment of how we're going against each of those 4 buckets I mentioned. Look, I think I'm lucky in that I've been there a little while now, and over time you build those relationships. But we work hard particularly with the execs that represent the really big people populations, to add value and to do all sorts of stuff that is about, I guess, building our credibility and, earning that right to have those conversations.
Cool. 2 minutes to go, and I'm going to ask you one last question. Love the simple approach to strategy. This is from Edwina. And what are we going to do? So how often do you check back in with your broader internal comms goals and objectives?
Well, I'm forced to every 6 months through our engagement survey, and so I'm performance measured against quite hard targets that come out of the engagement survey that relate very specifically to those 4 areas that I spoke about. I'd say it's a combination of kind of all the time, and then in a harder, more formal fashion, probably every 6 months.
So metrics and evaluation would be quite important in all your work.
Yeah, metrics. So metrics at a channel and tactical level is a constant thing. So we measure what we can measure. I mean, if it's digital, we can measure it. So clicks, opens, views, all of those sort of things. It's harder, obviously, to measure for understanding on a day-to-day level. Things like team member circles have become, or are becoming, really important measures of how well we've communicated something. So it's quickly coming back to us now if, for instance, there's an issue that is around calls that we haven't equipped team members well enough to answer. But yeah, look, it's a huge part of it, Zora, but I reckon there's a lot more data than there used to be.
All right, well, 22 seconds. This countdown clock is freaky. God. It's seriously freaky. So lovely to talk to you again, Al. I'm really looking forward to catching up with you with a drink or 2 in hand soon. So thank you very much for today, and we're about to go to a lunch break. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Al.